Hey guys. Tonight, we drift gently into the past. We are leaving the noise and the blue light of the modern world behind us. Instead, we are stepping onto the rocky shores of a new world, where the mist curls over wooden palisades and the air smells of salt, damp earth, and wood smoke. We are going to Colonial America. Not the version you learned in school with the shouting politicians and the war drums, but the real version. The quiet version. The version made of muddy boots, flickering tallow candles, and the long, silent hours of winter nights. Settle in. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillows and let your shoulders drop. If you enjoy drifting off to these stories from the past, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep the fire burning in the hearth. Also, leave a comment down below. Let me know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is there. I always love reading them when the sun comes up. But for now, close your eyes. Imagine the sound of the wind rattling a diamond-paned window. Imagine the scratch of wool against skin. Tonight, we wander through their days. From the first rooster crow before dawn to the final prayer whispered into the dark. We will look at what they ate, how they slept, what they feared in the deep woods, and how they found warmth in a world that was often very, very cold. Let's begin. The day in Colonial America began before the sun. It almost always did. There were no alarm clocks, of course, no digital chimes to gently nudge you from your dreams. There was only the cold. In the depths of a New England winter, or even a damp Virginia autumn, the cold was a physical weight inside the house. You would wake up because the heat from the hearth, banked carefully the night before, had finally faded, and the chill was creeping under the heavy quilts. If you were lucky, you were warm beneath a pile of bedding, perhaps sharing a mattress with 2 or 3 other family members. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist for most people. The concept of a bedroom as a private sanctuary was something for the very wealthy, or perhaps a dream for the future. For the average family, sleep was a communal activity, a huddled mass of bodies sharing warmth against the draft that whistled through the chinking of the log walls. You would wake to the sound of breathing, the slow, rhythmic breathing of your spouse, your children, perhaps even a servant or an apprentice sleeping on a trundle bed nearby. The first person up was usually the mother or the oldest daughter. Her feet would hit the floorboard's rough-hewn planks that were often sanded smooth. By years of footstep sand, she would move quickly to the fireplace. This was the heart of the home, the soul of the house. Without the fire, the house was just a box of wood standing in the wilderness. She would take the iron poker and stir the ashes, looking for the glow of embers saved from the night before. If the fire had gone out completely, it was a disaster. It meant sending a child running to a neighbor's house with a metal scoop to borrow live coals, or striking flint and steel with cold, clumsy fingers until a spark caught the tinder. But usually, with a little breath and some dry kindling, the flames would leap back to life. The smell of wood smoke would instantly fill the room, a smell that permeated everything in colonial life. Your clothes, your hair, your skin, your food. Everything smelled of oak, or hickory, or pine smoke. It was the cologne of the 17th century. Once the fire was crackling, the water could be boiled. Then, the rest of the house would begin to stir. There was no lingering in bed, scrolling through thoughts, or staring at the ceiling. The day was dictated by light. Candles were expensive. Whale oil was precious. You worked while the sun was up, and you rose to meet it. Getting dressed was a process of layering. In the summer, it was linen shifts and breeches, but for much of the year, it was wool. Heavy, scratchy, durable wool. Underwear as we know it didn't exist. Men and women wore a long linen shift or shirt next to their skin. This was the only piece of clothing that was washed regularly. It was the barrier between your body and your outer clothes, catching the sweat and the oils. Over this, a woman would put on her stay-stiffened bodices that provided support, and then her petticoats. Not just one, but 2 or 3, for warmth and volume. A separate pocket would be tied around her waist under the top skirt, accessed through a slit in the fabric. This was her purse, her toolbox, her secret keeper. Men pulled on breeches that stopped at the knee, followed by thick stockings. There were no zippers, no Velcro. Everything was tied with laces or fastened with buttons made of wood, bone, or pewter. Getting dressed took time. It was a ritual of fastening yourself against the world. And as you dressed, you might glance out the small window. Glass was expensive, so windows were small, letting in just enough light to work by. Outside, the world was grey and misty, the mist curling off the river, or the frost glittering on the pumpkin vines. Breakfast was not the grand affair of eggs and bacon we imagine today. In the early colonial days, especially in the north, breakfast was often just leftovers. A pot of hasty pudding cornmeal mush boiled in milk or water might be warming by the fire. It was thick, bland, and filling. If you were wealthy, you might have molasses or butter to put on it. If you were poor, you ate it plain, or perhaps you had a chunk of bread and cheese, washed down with cider or small beer. Yes, beer, even for the children. The water in Europe had been dangerous for centuries, full of bacteria and disease. The colonists brought that fear with them, even though the rushing streams of America were pristine. They didn't trust water, so they brewed beer. Small beer had a very low alcohol content, just enough to kill the germs, but not enough to make you drunk. It was a source of calories and hydration. Imagine waking up to a bowl of warm corn mush and a mug of weak, room temperature beer. It was fuel, pure and simple. The morning chores began immediately. For the men, it was out to the barn or the fields. Animals needed feeding. Cows needed milking. The livestock were smaller than the animals we know today. Cows were leaner. Pigs were razor-backed and hairy, more like wild boars. They roamed semi-freely in the woods, rooting for acorns, and had to be called in or hunted down. For the women, the house was a factory. We think of housework today as cleaning, vacuuming, dusting, wiping counters. But in colonial times, housework was manufacturing. Almost everything the family needed, the woman had to make. She didn't just buy soap. She made it from animal fat and wood ash, a foul-smelling, caustic process that took days. She didn't just buy candles. She dipped lengths of wick into melted tallow animal fat again hundreds of times, layer by layer, until a candle formed. Tallow candles smoked and smelled like burning meat. but they gave light. And then there was the spinning. The whir-whir-whir of the spinning wheel was the soundtrack of the colonial home. If a woman sat down, her hands were moving, knitting, sewing, mending, spinning. Cloth was incredibly valuable. To make a single shirt took hundreds of hours of labor if you started from the sheep. Shearing, washing the wool, carding it to straighten the fibers, spinning it into thread, weaving it on a loom, and finally cutting and sewing. You didn't throw clothes away when they got a hole. You patched them, and when the patches wore out, you patched the patches. As the sun climbed higher, the house would warm up, but the smell would also rise. We have to be honest about the smells. Colonial America was an olfactory experience that would likely knock a modern person unconscious. People bathed rarely, not because they were dirty people, but because they believed that bathing opened the pores and let disease enter the body. They washed their hands and faces, they rinsed their linen undergarments, but full body immersion was rare and viewed with suspicion. So, there was the smell of unwashed bodies. Layered on top of that was the smell of the chamber pot. There was no indoor plumbing. If you had to go in the middle of the night, you used a ceramic or pewter pot kept under the bed. In the morning, this had to be emptied into the privy or a designated spot in the garden. Add to this the smell of curing tobacco hanging from the rafters, the scent of pickling vinegar, the musk of drying herbs, and the ever-present wood smoke. It was a rich, dense atmosphere, but people were used to it. It was just the scent of being alive. By midday, the main meal was prepared. This was dinner, served around noon or 1 o'clock. This was when the sun was highest, and the workers needed the most energy. In the South, on the plantations or smaller tobacco farms, the diet was different from the North. There was more pork, more hominy. In New England, you might have a boiled dinner meat and vegetables all cooked together in one pot. Forks were rare in the early days. You used a spoon and a knife. You ate from a trencher or wooden board with a hollowed-out center. Sometimes, a husband and wife would share a trencher, eating from the same bowl. It was intimate. It was necessary. Salt was the king of the table. Without refrigeration, the only way to keep meat from rotting was to pack it in salt. Barrels and barrels of salted beef and pork lined the cellars, creating a unique aroma that was both a staple and a challenge for the colonists. Before cooking, that meat had to soak for hours just to make it somewhat edible, and even then, it was still pretty salty. To balance out all that saltiness, they loaded up on starches. Think peas porridge, beans, and corn. Oh, corn was truly the savior of the colonies. When the English first landed, their wheat crops totally flopped. The climate was just too harsh, and the seasons? Completely different from what they were used to back home. But thankfully, the Native Americans stepped in and taught them all about maize. It was like a miracle crop. It grew just about anywhere, was super hardy, and could be dried and stored for years. Imagine living in colonial America, where corn was basically on your plate every single day. They used it in so many ways: mush, bread, cakes, pudding, you name it. After the noon meal, the work kept rolling. But let us take a little break from the farm life and stroll into town for a moment. If you lived in a place like Williamsburg or Boston, the streets were narrow and winding, often just packed dirt that turned into thick, sucking mud when it rained. No sidewalks here, folks. You were walking right alongside horses and carts, dodging the occasional pile of horse manure. The sounds of the town were a whole different vibe compared to the countryside. In the country, it was all about the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional animal sound. But in town, it was a symphony of industry. You'd hear the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, marking the hours like a clock, the rasp of the saw in the carpenter's shop, and the cooper hammering hoops onto barrels. Those barrels were like the cardboard boxes of the era. Everything was shipped in barrels: flour, nails, salted fish, gunpowder, rum, you name it. The cooper was a vital guy in the community. And then there were the sounds of gossip. You might catch the town crier calling out the news, or just overhear whispers passing from person to person at the well. The well was the ultimate social hub, kind of like the water cooler of the 17th century. It's where you'd hear all the juicy tidbits: who was sick, who was getting hitched, and whose cows had broken through a fence. But let's not sugarcoat it. There was also a sense of vigilance in the towns. A nervousness hung in the air. Back in those early days, there was always the looming fear of attack from Native American tribes pushing back against the invasion of their lands, or from rival European powers like the French or Spanish. Many towns had blockhouses or palisades for protection. Men were required to train with the militia. On training days, they'd gather on the green, marching back and forth with their muskets. It was serious business, but also a social event to break from the relentless routine of farming. And let's not forget about the invisible fears that haunted them. The colonists were deeply superstitious, living in a world where science hadn't yet explained away the shadows. If the butter didn't churn, it wasn't just about the temperature. It might mean a witch was at work. If a calf died, it could be a curse. The night was filled with things they couldn't see but definitely felt. They believed in omens. A comet streaking across the sky wasn't just a celestial ball of ice. It was a warning from God. A sudden gust of wind that blew out a candle, that might mean a spirit was passing through. Religion wasn't just a Sunday thing. It was the lens through which they viewed the entire world. In Puritan New England, sermons were the main form of entertainment and education. People would sit in unheated meeting houses for hours at a stretch listening to the minister. Can you imagine? It was freezing in the winter, and they'd bring small metal boxes called foot stoves, filled with hot coals, to keep their toes from frostbite. If you nodded off, a tithing man might tickle your face with a feather on a long pole or rap you sharply on the head with a knob if you were a man. You had to stay awake. Your soul depended on it. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. There was a quiet beauty to their faith. It gave them a structure to cope with the immense grief that was part of life back then. Death was everywhere. It lurked in the fever that swept through the village, in the childbirth bed, and in the infected cut that turned gangrenous. Parents often buried multiple children, and spouses lost partners at a young age. The graveyard was usually right in the center of town, a constant reminder of mortality. Memento mori, remember you will die. Sounds morbid, right? But for them, it was a call to live correctly and value the time they had. As the afternoon wore on, the light would shift. The golden hour in Colonial America must have been absolutely breathtaking, unfiltered by smog, casting long shadows across fields of wheat and tobacco. This was the signal to finish up the day's work. The animals needed to be brought in, with the chickens cooped up against the foxes, and the wood box filled for the night. Supper was a lighter meal, maybe just some leftovers from dinner or simple bread and milk. As the sun set, the world shrank. Without streetlights, the darkness was total. You didn't venture out after dark unless you really had to. The night belonged to the wolves, the owls, and the things that go bump in the dark. Inside the house, the family would gather round the fire once more. This was their only source of light. Candles were way too precious to burn all at once. They might use a rushlight, a dried reed dipped in fat which gave off a weak, sputtering glow. In that dim light, the father might read from the Bible, while the mother worked on some knitting that didn't require fine sight. They'd talk, sharing their worries and joys. This is the part of history we often overlook: the quiet conversations. They worried about the same things we do today. Will the crops survive the drought? Is the baby coughing too much? How will we pay the merchant for the new tools? But they also told stories, sang songs, folk songs from England, Scotland, or Ireland, carried across the ocean in their memories. These songs were their Netflix, their Spotify, bringing a sense of connection to their past. And then came the prayers, a heartfelt thanks to God for surviving another day. After that, it was time to bank the fire, covering the coals with ash to keep them smoldering until morning. The house would cool down quickly, and the family would return to their beds, piling on the quilts. Animal skins and heavy wool blankets. They'd lie in the dark, listening to the house settle, the creak of the timbers, the wind in the chimney, and the silence of a world without engines. They lived hard lives, physically demanding and fraught with danger, but there was a simplicity to it, a rhythm connected to the earth and the sky. And as they drifted off to sleep, they knew that tomorrow the rooster would crow, the fire would need to be lit, and the wheel would turn again. Life was a cycle, a dance with nature, and they were all part of it. Welcome back to the fireside. The embers are still glowing, casting those long, dancing shadows against the wall. We have seen how the day begins and ends, but to understand the life of a colonist, we must understand the year. We must understand the seasons. Today, we look at our calendars on glowing screens, planning vacations months in advance, annoyed if rain ruins a weekend picnic. But for the people living in the 1600s and 1700s, the weather wasn't just a backdrop. It was the author of their lives. It dictated everything: what they ate, where they walked, and whether they lived or died. We must remember that they lived during a period climatologists call the Little Ice Age. The world was colder then. Winters in New England were not the mild, slushy affairs we sometimes see now. They were ferocious. They were white, silent beasts that swallowed the world whole. Imagine the silence of a colonial winter. There were no snowplows scraping the asphalt at 4 a.m. There was no hum of traffic on a distant highway. When the snow fell, it muffled the entire world. The forests, already dense and forbidding, became impassable walls of white. A heavy snowfall could cut a homestead off from the rest of humanity for weeks. For the family inside the small wooden house, The world shrank to the size of a single room. The hall, that main living area with the fireplace, became the entire universe. This was the season of shutting in. The windows were often shuttered tight to keep the heat in, making the day's twilight dim even at noon. You lived by firelight. The cold was a constant companion. It was said that in some New England winters, the ink would freeze in the inkwell while a man was trying to write a letter just feet from the fire. He would have to stop, hold the inkwell to the warmth, write a sentence, and then thaw it again. Imagine the patience that required. Imagine the cold that could creep through the walls like a ghost, ignoring the oak and the mud chinking. But there was a cozy, forced intimacy to winter. Since you couldn't work the fields, the pace of life slowed down. This was the time for mending. The men would sit by the fire, whittling new teeth for a rake, or repairing a harness. The women would spin, always spinning, the wheel turning, the foot treadle thumping softly on the floorboards. It was also the season of bundling. This is one of those curious colonial traditions that sounds scandalous to us, but was purely practical. When a young man came to court a young woman, he might have walked miles through the snow. It was too cold to sit in the parlor if there even was one, and fuel was too precious to burn a separate fire just for two teenagers to talk. So, the parents would allow the couple to get into bed together, fully clothed, of course, sometimes with a bundling board, a little plank of wood placed between them. They would lie there, under the heavy quilts, whispering, getting to know each other in the only warm place in the house. It was romance, colonial style, practical, a little awkward, but warm. As winter dragged on, the food changed. The fresh vegetables were long gone. The apples in the cellar were getting shriveled and soft. You were eating salted everything. Salted beef that had turned gray and hard as wood. Salted pork. Dried peas. The palate became dull. You craved something fresh, something green. But the ground was hard as iron. And then the thaw. We think of spring as a time of beauty flowers blooming, birds singing, and it was. But in colonial America, spring was also known as mud season, and it was a nightmare. When the deep snows of the Little Ice Age melted, the dirt roads, which were barely roads to begin with, turned into rivers of slurry. You couldn't walk in it. It would suck the boots right off your feet. You certainly couldn't drive a wagon through it. The wheels would sink to the axle. The world became sticky and brown. Travel stopped completely. You were trapped not by snow, but by the earth itself. The house would smell of damp wool and wet dogs. The floorboards would be permanently tracked with mud. And this was often the starving time. The winter stores were running out, but the new crops hadn't grown yet. You scraped the bottom of the barrel, quite literally, looking for the last of the flour. You looked at the seed corn the corn saved for planting, and your stomach rumbled. But you dared not eat it. If you ate the seed corn, you died next year. It was a test of discipline against hunger. But eventually, the mud dried, and then came the green. The explosion of life in the virgin forests of America was intense. The trees were massive, forming a canopy so thick that in some places, the forest floor was in perpetual shadow. Summer brought the heat, and with the heat came the insects. If you read the diaries of early travelers, They don't complain about the wolves or the bears nearly as much as they complain about the mosquitoes. There were no window screens. Let that sink in. No screens. If you opened the window for a breeze, you invited the swarm. If you kept it closed, you suffocated in the heat. And remember the clothes, the wool, the linen shifts. Modesty and custom dictated that you didn't strip down. A farmer out in the tobacco fields of Virginia, under the humid, oppressive July sun, was wearing breeches, stockings, a shirt, and often a vest or waistcoat. Sweat was just a constant state of being. You didn't try to get dry, you just accepted the dampness. The smell of the summer town was distinct. The heat cooked the garbage in the streets. It ripened the privies. People carried nosegays, small bunches of fragrant herbs and flowers, not just to look pretty, but to hold under their noses when the breeze shifted the wrong way. But summer was also the time of plenty. The gardens were bursting. Lettuce, radishes, squashes. The berries in the wild were ripe strawberries, blackberries, blueberries. The colonists had a sweet tooth, but sugar was an expensive import from the Caribbean. So they used honey or maple syrup tapped from the trees in spring to sweeten the summer fruits. The days were long. You worked until you couldn't see your hands in front of your face. But the evenings were for the porch. If you had a porch, or just the doorstep. Sitting there, listening to the cicadas screaming in the trees, watching the fireflies, lightning bugs, drift over the tall grass. The air would finally cool down, just a little. You might smoke a pipe of tobacco. Even the women smoked, using small clay pipes. The smoke helped keep the gnats away. It was a moment of peace in a life of labor. Then, the air would crisp, the light would turn golden and slanted. Autumn. For the colonist, autumn wasn't about pumpkin spice lattes and cozy sweaters. It was a race. It was a frantic, desperate race against the coming winter. The harvest had to be brought in. Every single ear of corn, every sheaf of wheat, every apple. If you left it in the field too long, the frost would kill it, and your family would go hungry. It was all hands on deck. Children, heavy with fatigue, dragging baskets of apples. Women picking and preserving from dawn until dusk. The kitchen would be a factory of preservation, drying herbs in bundles from the rafters until the ceiling looked like an inverted garden. Smoking hams in the smokehouse. Making cider. Cider was the lifeblood of the autumn. Apples grew well in America, better than the barley needed for beer. So they crushed the apples, pressed the juice, and let it ferment. Everyone drank hard cider. It was safe, it was caloric, and it warmed the blood. There was a specific anxiety to autumn, a checking of lists. Do we have enough wood? Is the roof patched? Are the blankets mended? You were fortifying your castle for the siege of winter. But when the harvest was done, there was the husking bee. This was a party. The neighbors would gather in a barn to strip the husks off the thousands of ears of corn. It was work, but they made it a game. If a young man found a red ear of corn, he was allowed to kiss the girl of his choice. You can imagine the excitement, the blushing, the laughter in the dim lantern light of the barn, the smell of dry corn husks, the dust floating in the air, the sound of fiddles starting up as the work finished. They would dance, not the polite, stiff dances of the Victorian era that came later, but lively, stomping dances. jigs and reels. They would eat pumpkin bread and drink new cider. They would celebrate the fact that they had won. They had wrestled enough food from the earth to survive another year. And then the first snowflake would fall. The grey sky would lower itself onto the treetops. The door would be barred. The fire would be built up high. And the cycle would begin again. This circular rhythm: cold, mud, heat, harvest. Cold was the clock by which they set their lives. They didn't measure time in minutes or hours as much as they measured it in light and seasons. They were patient people. They had to be. You cannot hurry a crop. You cannot hurry the winter. You can only endure it. But amidst this endurance, there were the smaller, sharper pains of daily life. The things that didn't kill you, but made life difficult. The toothaches, the blisters, the hunger that wasn't quite starvation, but a constant, gnawing emptiness. To understand childhood in colonial America, we must first discard our modern ideas of it. Today, we see childhood as a protected garden, a time of innocence and play, separate from the burdens of the adult world. The colonists saw it differently. To them, a child was simply a small adult in training. They were born with original sin, wild spirits that needed to be tamed, disciplined, and molded into useful members of the family economy as quickly as possible. Until the age of about 6 or 7, boys and girls dressed alike. They both wore long gowns or shifts. This was practical. It made diaper changes easier and allowed for growth. But around age 7, a boy was breeched. He was given his first pair of pants. It was a momentous day. It signaled that his babyhood was over. He was now a little man. From the moment they could walk, children were given jobs. A 3-year-old might be tasked with picking up kindling. A 5-year-old was feeding chickens or weeding the garden. By 7, a girl was learning to spin and knit. A boy was learning to handle an axe or a specialized tool. There was no teenager phase. You went from child to adult. If you weren't needed on your own family's farm, or if your family was too poor to feed you, you might be bound out as an apprentice or a servant. Imagine being 10 years old and sent away to live with a strange family, learning to be a blacksmith or a silversmith, or just a housemaid. You signed a contract and indenture that bound you to your master for 7 years or more. You belonged to them. You couldn't marry. You couldn't leave. You couldn't trade without their permission. But surely they played? Yes, they did. But their toys were simple, often made from the scraps of the adult world. A doll made of corn husks. A ball made of rags wrapped in leather. A hoop rolled with a stick, a hoop taken from an old barrel. They played blind man's bluff and tag. They played with marbles made of clay. But even their play was often practice. Girls played house because they were practicing to run one. Boys played at hunting or warfare because those were the realities awaiting them. Education was a mixed bag. In New England, the Puritans were obsessed with literacy. Why? Not so you could read novels. Novels were considered frivolous lies, but so you could read the Bible. If you couldn't read the Bible, Satan could trick you. So laws were passed, the famous old Deluder Satan Act, requiring towns of a certain size to build schools. The schoolhouse was usually a single bleak room. The children sat on hard benches, often freezing in the winter, because each student was expected to contribute wood for the stove. If your parents forgot the wood, you sat in the coldest corner. They learned from a hornbook. This wasn't a book at all. It was a wooden paddle with a piece of paper pasted on it, covered by a thin, transparent sheet of animal horn to protect it from sticky fingers. On the paper was the alphabet, the Lord's Prayer, and perhaps some Roman numerals. That was it. That was your iPad, your textbook, your library. Discipline was swift and physical. The birch rod was always in the corner. Spare the rod and spoil the child was not a metaphor. It was a parenting manual. A child who spoke out of turn or was lazy was beaten. It was believed that you had to beat the sin out of them. But let us not paint it as purely grim. There was affection. Diaries tell of fathers bringing home ribbons for their daughters, of mothers nursing sick children with desperate tenderness. They were strict because they wanted their children to survive. In a world where one wrong step could mean starvation or social ruin, discipline was a form of love. Now, let us broaden our view from the family to the society around them. The colonies were not a democracy. Not really. They were a hierarchy. Everyone had a place, and you were expected to stay in it. Social status was visible. It was illegal in some places for a poor person to wear silk or gold lace. Those were sumptuary laws. If you were a laborer and you wore a silk scarf, you could be fined. You were dressing above your station. The church was where this hierarchy was most visible. The pews in the meeting house were not first come, first served. They were assigned. Doomed was the term based on your wealth and status. The richest merchant sat in the front box. The yeoman farmer sat in the middle. The servants, the poor, and the enslaved sat in the back or up in the drafty gallery. Every Sunday, you were physically reminded of exactly where you stood in the pecking order, and what happened if you broke the rules. Colonial justice was public. It was designed to shame you. There were no long prison sentences. Prisons were just holding cells before trial. Punishment was bodily and visible. If you were a gossip or a nag, you might be sentenced to the ducking stool. You were tied to a chair at the end of a lever and dunked into the river or pond, over and over, while the town watched and laughed. If you were a drunkard, you might have to wear a large letter D on your chest, or stand in the pillory or the stocks. The stocks bound your ankles. The pillory bound your neck and wrists. You stood there in the town square for hours. People could throw rotten fruit at you, or mud, or just insults. The pain was in the cramping of your muscles, but the real punishment was the humiliation. To be stared at by your neighbors, to be the example. Branding was also used. A thief might be branded on the hand with a hot iron. A T for thief, a B for burglar. It was a permanent mark of shame. But beneath this rigid order, there was tension. There was the other. The colonists were living on the edge of a vast continent that they did not understand, and that was not theirs. The relationship with the Native Americans was complex, shifting from trade and assistance to horrific violence. In the early years, the settlers would not have survived without the help of the Wampanoag or the Powhatan. They traded metal knives, axes, and kettles for furs and food. There was intermingling. Some colonists, captured by tribes, actually refused to return to white society when given the chance. They preferred the freedom and the community of the tribe to the rigid, heavy, labor-intensive life of the colony. This terrified the colonial leaders. The idea that civilized people would choose the savage life was a threat to their entire worldview. But as more settlers arrived, the hunger for land grew insatiable. The fences went up. The pigs roamed into native cornfields. The treaties were broken. Fear of Indian attack was a constant background radiation in the lives of frontier families. A mother sending her children to pick berries in the woods watched them go with a tightening in her chest. A father ploughing his field kept his musket leaned against the fence post. This fear led to dark places. It led to preemptive violence. It led to a hardening of the heart. The frontier was a psychological space as much as a physical one, a place where the rules of civilization felt thin, where violence was a tool of survival. And yet, trade continued. You might see a native trader walking through the streets of Boston or Philadelphia, selling baskets or venison. You might see a colonist speaking a pidgin mix of English and Algonquian. It was a world of uncomfortable intimacy. Travel between the colonies was rare and difficult. A journey from Boston to New York could take a week or more. The roads were highways only in name. They were often just widened Indian trails, marked by blazes' axe cuts on the trees so you wouldn't get lost. If you traveled, you crossed rivers not by bridges, but by fords, shallow places, or ferries. Ferries were terrifying. Just a flat raft pulled across a rushing river by a rope. But travel also brought news. The post riders, the newspapers. The colonial newspaper was a marvel. For pages of dense, tiny type, it contained news from London that was 3 months old. But to them, it was fresh. It had advertisements. Runaway, an Irish servant man named Patrick, has a scar on his cheek. For sale, a parcel of healthy Negroes. Strayed, a red cow with a white flank. These ads tell us the story of their property, their labor, and their losses. And so, the colonial world churned on. A world of wood and iron, of Bible verses and superstitions, of strict order and wild chaos just beyond the fence. But as the 1700s wore on, something began to change. The tea became a little sweeter. The cloth became a little finer. A new word began to be whispered in the taverns. Not survival, but liberty. However, before we get to the revolutions and the wars, we must look at the night one last time. The time of secrets. Let us move closer to the hearth. If the house is the body of the colonial family, the hearth is its stomach. And it is a stomach that never stops rumbling, never stops demanding. We often have a romanticized view of colonial cooking. We picture a merry grandmother baking apple pies in a perfectly regulated oven while a turkey roasts on a spit. But the reality of the colonial kitchen was a battle zone of heat, heavy lifting, and chemical preservation. Cooking was done over an open fire, not a campfire, but a roaring, consuming blaze that could melt pewter if you weren't careful. For the women of the house, this meant their work was dangerous. Their skirts long, heavy layers of wool and linen were constantly near the flames. The number one cause of accidental death for women in this era was not childbirth, as some suspect, but burns. A stray spark, a skirt catching fire. It was a hazard woven into the fabric of making dinner. To cook a meal, you didn't turn a dial to 350 degrees. You had to navigate a landscape of embers, flames, and ash. You used a crane, a heavy iron arm that swung out from the stone wall of the fireplace. You would hang your pots on S-hooks from this crane, raising them or lowering them to control the heat. Lower down for a boil, higher up for a simmer. It was a skill that took a lifetime to master. You had to know the heat of hickory versus the heat of pine. You had to know how to rake coals out onto the hearth to create a small burner for a skillet, which they called a spider because it had long iron legs to stand over the coals. And what was in those heavy iron pots? Mostly, it was a mush. As we mentioned, corn was the monarch of the table. But let's really taste it for a moment. Imagine eating samp. Samp is corn kernels that have been pounded to a coarse grit, boiled in water until they form a thick, gelatinous porridge. It is grayish yellow. It has the texture of wet sand mixed with glue. It tastes of nothing but corn and perhaps the iron of the pot. You ate this for breakfast. You ate leftovers of it fried into cakes for lunch. You ate it with milk for supper, day after day, week after week. The columnists had a rhyme: pumpkin bread and porridge, pumpkin bread and porridge. If it wasn't for pumpkin bread and porridge, I'd be in the workhouse. They ate so much pumpkin that they were sometimes derisively called pumpkins by the British back home. But the pumpkin was a miracle. It grew amongst the corn, shading the roots. It could be stored in a root cellar for months without rotting. But try to imagine the fatigue of the palate, the desperate craving for anything that wasn't corn or pumpkin. This is why spices were worth their weight in gold. A nutmeg, a canister of pepper, a cone of sugar. These were locked away in tea caddies like jewels. To sprinkle a little nutmeg on your pumpkin mush was to taste the exotic, to taste wealth. Then there was the meat. If you were on the frontier, you hunted. And the American wilderness in the 1600s was teeming with life in a way we can scarcely comprehend today. One of the most common foods was the passenger pigeon. There are accounts from the 1700s describing flocks of these birds so massive they blocked out the sun for hours as they flew overhead. The noise of their wings was like thunder. They were so numerous you didn't even need to aim. You just fired a shotgun into the sky and birds fell like rain. Or you could knock them out of the trees with a pole. Because they were so easy to catch, people ate them constantly. Pigeon pie, roasted pigeon, stewed pigeon. Servants and apprentices in New England actually had clauses written into their contracts, stating that they would not be forced to eat lobster or pigeon more than 3 times a week. Lobster, back then, was considered trash fish, fit only for the poor or for fertilizer. It washed up on the beaches in piles. How times have changed. But for most of the year, the meat wasn't fresh. It was salted. We have lost our tolerance for salt. If a modern person ate a piece of colonial salt pork, they would likely gag. To preserve meat without ice, you had to pack it in layers of coarse salt in a wooden barrel. The salt drew the moisture out, turning the meat into a hard, dry slab. Before you could eat it, you had to soak it in fresh water for a day, changing the water multiple times just to make it palatable. Even then, it retained a briny, intense flavor. This diet heavy on salt heavy on starch, low on fresh vitamins for half the year had consequences. Scurvy wasn't just for sailors. By late winter, many colonists were suffering from bleeding gums, loose teeth, and lethargy. They were simply running out of vitamin C. This is why the first greens of spring dandelion greens, proxalate, rumps were greeted with such joy. They were bitter, tough weeds, but they were medicine. They woke the body up. Let's look at the table itself. It was usually a trestle table, loose boards laid over sawhorses. When the meal was done, the table was dismantled and put against the wall to make room. The term board for a table and room and board comes from this. In the early days, you didn't have your own plate. You used a trencher. This was a square block of wood with a bowl-like depression hollowed out in the middle. Often, a husband and wife, or two siblings, would share a trencher. You sat side by side, dipping your spoons into the same stew. It required coordination. It required getting along. And you didn't use a fork. Forks were considered an affectation, a silly Italian trend that was seen as effeminate or pretentious. God gave you fingers. Why use a metal claw? You used a spoon for the wet stuff and a knife to cut the meat and spear it to your mouth. If you were eating solid food, you used your hands. Napkins were large because things got messy. Dinner was a serious affair. In pious households, there was no talking. Children were to be seen and not heard. You ate quickly, fueling the body for the next round of work. You kept your hat on. Men usually wore their hats indoors and at the table, taking them off only for prayer. And what did you wash it down with? Water was suspect. Milk was for calves or for cooking cheese. So, everyone drank alcohol. Cider for the common days. Rum if you could get it. The colonists were heavy drinkers by modern standards. It is estimated that by the time of the Revolution, the average American drank nearly 4 gallons of pure alcohol a year. That's double what we drink today. But they didn't drink to get wasted in the modern sense. They drank a steady, low-level buzz all day long. They had drinks we have forgotten. The flip, for instance. This was a winter drink. You took a mug of beer, added some rum and sugar, and then here is the trick. You took a red-hot iron poker from the fireplace, glowing orange, and plunged it into the mug. The liquid would hiss and foam. The sugar would caramelize instantly, and the drink would become warm and frothy. It tasted of burnt sugar and malt. A loggerhead was the name of the tool used to heat the drink. If 2 men got into a fight using these iron tools, they were at loggerheads. History hides in our language. But while there was often plenty of corn and cider, there was also the shadow of true hunger. We must speak of the starving times. In the very early years, in places like Jamestown, the hunger was apocalyptic. There are dark stories in the colonial past. Stories of people eating their horses, then their dogs, then the rats in the corn store. Stories of people boiling their leather boots to chew on the soft leather for a few calories. Those extreme days passed as the colonies stabilized, but hunger remained a seasonal neighbor. If the blight took the wheat, or the drought took the corn, you went hungry. You learned to ignore the growling stomach. You learned to tighten the belt. There is a concept called hidden hunger. You might be full of corn mush, your belly distended, but your body is starving for protein, for fats. You become weak. Your hair thins. You catch colds easily. This was the reality for the poor, for the indentured servants, for the slaves who were given the scraps. And eating this way heavy, rough, often slightly spoiled food meant that digestion was a constant topic of conversation and concern. Their stomachs were often upset. Dysentery, which they called the bloody flux, was a terrified word. It could kill you in days. Because they didn't understand bacteria, they blamed the food's humors. They thought cucumbers were poisonous if not cooked. They thought tomatoes were deadly nightshades which, to be fair, they are related to. They boiled their vegetables until they were grey mush because they believed raw vegetables were hard on the stomach. Ironically, by boiling them to death, they destroyed most of the nutrients, making their health worse. It was a cycle of trying to nourish the body while accidentally depriving it. And this brings us to the body itself, the vessel that had to be fed, clothed, and worked. What happened when that vessel broke? What happened when the fever spiked, or the axe slipped, or the mysterious pains began in the night? In a world without antibiotics, without anesthesia, and without knowledge of germs, medicine was a frightening mixture of folklore, prayer, and desperate, painful measures. Let us walk softly now. We are entering the sick room. In the colonial imagination, the body was not a machine of pumps and filters as we see it today. It was a vessel of fluids. They followed the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To be healthy was to be balanced. To be sick meant that one of these fluids was out of whack. Too much heat, too much moisture, too much cold. Therefore, the doctor's job was not to kill a virus, but to force the body back into balance. And the methods were brutal. Imagine you wake up with a fever. Your throat is raw. Your head is pounding. In 2024, you take a pill and sleep. In 1724, you are in trouble. The fever means you have too much blood, too much heat. The pressure must be released. So, the barber surgeon, yes, the man who cut hair also cut veins, would be summoned. Or perhaps just a knowledgeable neighbor. They would take a lancet, a small, sharp blade, and open a vein in your arm. They would let the blood flow into a pewter bowl until you felt faint. They believed this bad blood was carrying the sickness away. In reality, it was weakening you exactly when you needed strength the most. George Washington, on his deathbed, was bled of nearly 40% of his body's blood volume in a single day. He didn't die of his throat infection. Many historians argue he died of the cure. If bleeding didn't work, they tried purging. You would be given emetics concoctions made of heavy metals like mercury or antimony to make you vomit violently, or laxatives to clear the bowels. They believed the sickness had to be expelled physically and forcefully. And then there were the blisters. To draw the poison out of your chest during a cough, they might apply a blister plaster made of caustic herbs or even crushed beetles' Spanish fly to your skin. It would chemically burn you, raising a massive, painful blister. They would pop it, believing the pus was the illness leaving your body. Pain was simply a fact of life. There was no aspirin, no ibuprofen. If you had a toothache, and everyone had toothaches, you suffered until the tooth rotted out. Or you paid a blacksmith to yank it out with pliers. Most adults had gaps in their smiles by their 30s. A full set of teeth in old age was a miracle, but not all medicine was torture. There was also the kitchen physic. This was the domain of the women. Every housewife was also a pharmacist. Her garden was her drugstore. She grew sage for colds, chamomile for sleep, peppermint for the stomach, comfrey for knitting broken bones. She knew that willow bark, chewed, could dull pain. It contains the precursor to aspirin. She knew that a poultice of moldy bread could sometimes stop an infection, a crude, accidental penicillin. There was a gentleness to this side of care. The cool cloth on the forehead, the herbal tea sipped by candlelight, the receipt book, a handwritten journal of recipes, and medical cures passed down from mother to daughter. Take 3 snails and roast them. Boil the roots of sassafras. These books were treasured, but despite the herbs and the prayers, death was a constant visitor. It is hard for us to wrap our minds around the infant mortality rate. In some places and times, 1 infant children died before their first birthday. Another 1 in 4 might die before puberty. Parents did not love their children any less than we do. In fact, their diaries reveal a heartbreaking intensity of love, precisely because they knew how fragile those little lives were. But they had to steel themselves. They gave their children names like comfort, hope, patience, or even wait still, reflecting their anxiety. Sometimes, if a child named John died, the next son born would also be named John. They were trying to keep the name, and perhaps the spirit, alive. When death came, it happened at home. There were no hospitals for the dying. You died in your own bed, surrounded by your family. The windows might be opened to let the soul fly out. The mirrors might be covered so the spirit wouldn't get trapped in the reflection. And then the community took over. The laying out of the body was done by the women of the neighborhood. They washed the body, dressed it in a shroud. The local carpenter would build a simple pine coffin. There was no embalming. The funeral had to happen quickly. Funerals were major social events. Paradoxically, they were often parties. You had to feed the guests who came from miles away. Enormous amounts of food and alcohol were consumed. At some funerals, the cost of the rum and the funeral gloves gifts given to the pallbearers cost more than the doctor's bills. It was a way to affirm life in the face of death, to get drunk, to eat, to say, "We are still here." But there were diseases that terrified them beyond all reason. Smallpox. Smallpox was the specter that haunted the colonies. It came in waves, usually arriving on a ship from London or the West Indies. When the news spread, "The pox is in Boston," people fled. They shut themselves in their country homes. They blocked the roads. Smallpox didn't just kill, it disfigured. If you survived, you were often left with deep, pitted scars on your face for life. It could blind you. It was a horror. But here, in the early 1700s, we see a flicker of modern science. A man named Cotton Mather, a Puritan minister famous for his role in the witch trials, actually helped introduce inoculation to America. He had learned it from an enslaved man named Onesimus. Onesimus told Mather that in Africa, people would take a little pus from a smallpox victim and rub it into a scratch on a healthy person's arm. The person would get a mild case, recover, and never get it again. It sounded insane to the colonists. Injecting the disease to stop the disease. When Mather and a doctor named Zabdiel Boylston started doing it, people were furious. Someone threw a primitive grenade through Mather's window with a note. "Cotton Mather, you dog. Damn you. I'll inoculate you with this. A pox to you." But it worked. Those who were inoculated survived at much higher rates. It was the beginning of the end for the Great Plagues, though they didn't know it yet. Let's step back from the edge of the grave, though. Life wasn't all sickness. Most days were simply tiring. People were smaller then. The average man was perhaps 5 feet 6 inches, or 5 feet 7. The ceilings in old colonial houses are low not just to keep the heat in, but because people didn't need the clearance. They were lean, weary, with hands calloused like leather. They aged quickly. A woman of 40 might look 60 to our eyes, her skin weathered by the sun and wood smoke, her body worn by a dozen pregnancies. They lived with a level of physical discomfort we would find maddening .itches, .rashes, .lice. Bedbugs were a plague. A common travel advice was to pull your bed away from the wall in a tavern and put the legs of the bed in pans of water to create a moat so the bugs couldn't crawl up. And the shoes. Oh, the shoes. They were made of straight leather, with no difference between left and right. You had to break them in by wearing them until they molded to your feet. It was agony. People often went barefoot in the summer, even adults, simply to spare their feet and save the leather. Yet, within these hard, itchy, fragile bodies, there was immense resilience. They laughed. They found joy. They found it in the tavern. The tavern, or the ordinary, was the living room of the community. It was where the mail was dropped off. It was where the court was held. Judges often heard cases while sipping ale. It was where travelers slept, often 3 or, for strangers, to a bed. Picture the tavern at night. The air is thick with tobacco smoke. A fire roars in a massive hearth that takes up half the wall. Men are sitting on benches, drinking out of pewter tankards or leather mugs coated in pitch. They are playing cards, though in Puritan areas they have to hide them. They are playing shovelboard. The talk is of the price of tobacco, the rumors of war with the French, the new governor. It is loud. It is warm. It is the one place where the isolation of the farm falls away. But what about the children? We have spoken of their deaths, but what of their lives? How did a child grow up? In this world of hard work and hard prayers, was there room for play? Was there room for childhood? As we know it, we've chatted about work, sweat, and the tough realities of just getting by. But let us take a moment to remember that the folks from back then weren't just machines made of wood and iron. They had hearts that thumped with all the same feelings we have today. Underneath those heavy wool coats and stiff linen dresses, they fell in love, felt lonely, and danced through the complicated world of courtship. So, let us step into a parlor, or what they called a keeping room, on a Saturday night. Shall we? Imagine this. Everyone's working from dawn till dusk. So finding a moment to fall in love was a real challenge. No texting or swiping right on an app. You had to wait, and that waiting made everything feel even more special. If a young man in New England wanted to court a young woman, he had to muster up some serious courage. He'd often walk miles in the dark to knock on her father's door, not just hoping to win her heart, but auditioning for her entire family. Can you picture it? He'd sit quietly in the corner while her dad read the Bible and her mom spun wool. The air thick with silence. Every word he managed to squeeze out was weighed and measured like gold. But here's the thing, these young folks found ways to communicate without saying much at all. There was this sweet language of small gifts. Ever heard of a love spoon? It was a common token of affection. A young man might spend months carving a spoon from a single piece of wood. The more intricate the design, think interlocking chains, hearts, or even cages with little wooden bowls, the more it showed off his patience and skill. Giving it to a girl was like making a proposal. If she hung it on her wall, he had a shot. If she handed it back, well, that was a heartbreak waiting to happen. And then there was this wild concept called bundling. We touched on it a bit during winter, but let's dig deeper. It might sound a little strange to us today. In the freezing cold of a colonial winter, firewood was a precious commodity. You couldn't waste it keeping the parlor warm just for two teenagers to sit and chat. So the parents would allow them to share a bed, but with some strict rules. They kept all their clothes on layer upon layer of heavy wool. Sometimes they'd even use a bundling board, which was literally a plank of wood placed between them in bed. Or the girl's legs might be tied together in a bundling sack. It might sound comical, or even a bit scandalous, but for them, it was practical. It allowed a bit of intimacy without freezing to death. They could whisper in the dark, share secrets, and learn the sound of each other's breathing. But not all romances followed the rules set by parents. There were those disorderly loves, the servant girl who fell for the apprentice next door, or the couples sneaking off into the woods, away from the watchful eyes of the tithing man. In the southern colonies, things were a bit different, more aristocratic. Courtship was like a dance, literally. At balls and plantation houses, the minuet was a way to connect in public. A brush of a hand, a bow, a glance across the room, these were all part of the game. Fans were used like secret signals. If a fan was held a certain way, it meant I'm interested. If it snapped shut, it was a clear go away. Now, marriage wasn't just about romance. It was often more like a business merger. When a couple decided to tie the knot, negotiations kicked off. It wasn't about fancy diamond rings. It was about cows, acres, and pewter plates. A father might say, "I'll give my daughter a feather bed and to pigs." And the suitor would counter with, "I'll bring 20 acres of cleared land." It might sound cold, but think about it in context. They were building a survival unit. A farm couldn't run without a wife managing the dairy, garden, and clothes. And a woman couldn't easily survive without a husband handling the heavy lifting and legal stuff. They needed each other to thrive. The wedding itself was usually pretty simple. In Puritan New England, marriage was more of a civil contract than a sacred ceremony. There were no church weddings. You got hitched by a magistrate, often right in your own home. And it was over quickly. But the party, the affair, that's where the real joy came alive. Can you just imagine the relief? The harvest was in, the couple was wed, and then the fiddle starts to play. The music of colonial America was raw and full of life. Think fiddles, flutes, maybe even a dulcimer. They played reels and jigs that had traveled all the way from Scotland and Ireland. And let me tell you, The dancing wasn't the polite swaying we see in movies today. It was energetic and wild. The floorboards would shake with the stomp of their feet. Then there was this hilarious tradition called the shivaree. After the couple had retired to their bedroom, the young men of the town would gather outside with pots, pans, bells, and muskets. They'd create a deafening racket banging, shouting, and shooting into the air until the groom came out and treated them to liquor or money. It was a chaotic blessing, a way for the community to say, "We see you. You're one of us." But what about the lives of women after the wedding? In colonial America, a woman was legally femme covert, which means she was covered by her husband. She lost her legal identity. No owning property, no signing contracts. In the eyes of the law, she was a shadow. Yet, in the privacy of their homes, women were the engines of the economy. They were the deputy husbands. When the men were off at war or away on long trading trips, the women ran the farms. They negotiated sales, managed debts, and kept everything running smoothly. They were far stronger and more independent than the law gave them credit for. And let's not forget about their networks. The gossipings were more than just idle chit-chat. When women gathered to quilt or help with childbirth, they formed a powerful jury. They policed the behavior of the men. If a husband was abusive or a drunkard, the women knew. And often, the social pressure they exerted the shunning. The whispers was way more effective than any sheriff. There's a quiet tragedy in the diaries of these women. You come across entries like, "The house is so still. My husband is gone to Boston. The wind howls." Like a lost child. You can really feel the weight of their isolation. But you also sense their resilience. They found beauty in the little things: a ribbon of bright blue silk bought from a traveling peddler, a patch of wildflowers by the creek, or the taste of a fresh strawberry in June. These small flashes of color were absolutely vital in a world that was mostly brown, gray, and mud-colored. So, while we look back and see the struggles and hardships, let's also celebrate the love, the laughter, and the moments of joy that punctuated their lives. They navigated a world filled with challenges, but they also created spaces for connection, warmth, and community, proving that even in the toughest times, the human spirit can shine bright. Can you picture the sounds of autumn in those woods? Just imagine the rustling of dry leaves as the pigs root around, the distant bark of a dog echoing through the trees, and the sharp crack of a branch breaking underfoot. It's such a magical time, right? Harvest season is in full swing, and you didn't even have to lift a finger to plant anything. The air is crisp, and the colors are bursting with oranges and reds. It's like nature's own celebration. You might even catch a glimpse of squirrels darting around, gathering their winter stash. Isn't it just the perfect backdrop for cozy gatherings and warm drinks? Nowadays, we think of forests as parks, right? Places to hike, maybe take a picnic, or just enjoy some bird watching. But back in the 17th and 18th centuries, forests were seen quite differently. They were often viewed as this wild, untamed enemy, a howling wilderness. Can you imagine? Those towering trees were ancient, and in places like New England and Pennsylvania, the old-growth forests were so thick that even at noon, sunlight barely touched the ground. The white pines stood like giants, reaching heights of over 200 feet. their trunks so wide that it would take 3 grown men holding hands just to wrap around them. Walking into those woods back then was like stepping into a cathedral, but not the kind filled with light and warmth. It was dark, damp, and indifferent. The ground was soft, cushioned by centuries of decaying pine needles and leaves, and the air was thick with the earthy scents of mushrooms, wet soil, and pine resin. And let me tell you, it was silent, not the kind of silence that feels empty, but a heavy, watchful silence, like the forest was keeping secrets. For the farmers of that time, the forest was a relentless adversary. Every field they cultivated was a battleground fought against stubborn roots. Chopping down a tree wasn't just a task, it was a struggle. The sound of the axe ringing out thwack, thwack, thwack echoed through the air day after day. And even when a tree finally crashed down with a mighty thud, the stump remained, a reminder of the fight. Colonial fields weren't the neat, manicured lawns we see today. They were scarred landscapes dotted with massive stumps. Farmers would just plow around them, waiting years for those stubborn hardwood stumps to rot enough to be pulled out. For a whole generation, they farmed amidst a graveyard of trees. But here's the twist: the forest wasn't just an enemy. It was also a grocery store. In autumn, the American chestnut trees dropped their nuts everywhere. These giants were once so plentiful, but now they're mostly extinct due to blight. Back then, though, they rained down sweet, starchy nuts by the millions. Farmers would let their pigs roam free in the woods, a practice known as pannage. Those razor-backed, half-wild pigs would scavenge the forest floor, gorging themselves on chestnuts and acorns. Can you picture the sounds of autumn in those woods? Just imagine the rustling of dry leaves as the pigs root around, the distant bark of a dog echoing through the trees, and the sharp crack of a branch breaking underfoot. It's such a magical time, right? Harvest season is in full swing, and you didn't even have to lift a finger to plant anything. The air is crisp, and the colors are bursting with oranges and reds. It's like nature's own celebration. You might even catch a glimpse of squirrels darting around, gathering their winter stash. Isn't it just the perfect backdrop for cozy gatherings and warm drinks? However, the woods had their own rules. If you looked closely at the tallest, straightest pines in New Hampshire or Maine, you'd notice 3 hatchet slashes on the bark, shaped like an arrow. This was known as the King's Broad Arrow. Those trees were claimed by the Royal Navy, reserved for the masts of the King's ships. It was illegal for colonists to cut them down, but necessity breeds creativity, right? People needed wood, and they resented the king for claiming trees in their own backyard. So, in the dead of night, the saw would quietly sing its song. Men would cut down those royal pines, saw them into boards, and burn the bark to hide their tracks. Many colonial homes were built from boards that were meant to sail the high seas. Talk about a secret rebellion underfoot. And then there was the ever-present fear of getting lost. Imagine wandering into the deep woods without a map or GPS. If you strayed off the deer trail, the green wall could swallow you whole. Stories were shared in hushed tones by the fire about children who wandered off to pick berries and were never seen again, or men who went hunting and ended up walking in circles until the cold took them. For colonists, the forest was this boundary between reality and chaos. Inside the fence, there was order, Bible verses, warm fires, and a sense of community. Outside, there was chaos, wolves, and the unknown. It's no wonder they locked their doors tight at night. But for some, the woods represented freedom. The long hunters and trappers chose to embrace that wild life. They wore shirts made of deerskin, darkened with grease and soot, making them waterproof against the rain. They'd sleep in hollow logs and feast on beaver tails and buffalo tongues. These men learned the languages of the tribes, the Algonquin, the Iroquois, becoming a bridge between two worlds, often belonging to neither. Can you imagine sitting by a small fire in the deep woods with one of these rugged individuals? The darkness is absolute, and the only sounds are the hoot of an owl or the snap of a twig. He might tell you that the forest isn't empty at all. It's alive, full of eyes watching you, full of spirits that whisper through the trees. The woods were a place of danger and beauty, a constant reminder of nature's power and mystery. They shaped the lives and minds of those early colonists in ways we can only begin to understand. It's a fascinating contrast, isn't it? The forest was both a battleground and a sanctuary, a source of fear and a place of freedom. So, what do you think? How does this wild landscape resonate with our modern lives today? Let us follow the sound of water now. Every colonial town was built near a stream or a creek, not just to drink from, but to work with. If the church was the soul of the community, the grist mill was its stomach and its beating heart. You would hear the mill long before you saw it. A deep, rhythmic rumble that vibrated up through the soles of your boots and into your bones. Grind, rumble, grind, splash. The mass of water will turn slowly under its own weight, its wooden buckets slick with green moss and algae slapping cold water into the race below. The air around the mill was always damp, carrying the clean, mineral smell of wet stone and rushing water. Step inside, and the world changed. The air was thick, almost solid. Flour dust hung suspended in the shafts of sunlight like a sweet, white fog. It coated everything: the heavy oak beams overhead, the worn floorboards, the leather sacks stacked in corners, the miller's face. The miller himself was a ghost in white. His eyebrows were dusted with fine meal. His eyelashes were white. His beard was a powder. His woolen apron was stiff with layers of dried flour. He moved through his cloud like a spirit, adjusting the hopper, listening to the song of the stones. Those stones were monsters. Each one weighed thousands of pounds, quarried from local granite or imported from France. The upper stone turned slowly against the lower, grinding your corn or rye or wheat into coarse meal or fine flour. The sound was hypnotic, a deep geological groan punctuated by the thump-thump of grain falling through the hopper. You brought your sack of grain on your back, waited your turn on a rough bench by the wall, and shouted conversation over the noise. This was a place of enforced patience. You couldn't hurry the stones, spin them too fast with too much water power, and the friction would scorch the flour, turning your harvest bitter and black. So you sat. You swapped stories about the late frost, the fox in the henhouse, the price of salt from the West Indies. The miller took his payment in grain, the toll, traditionally a 16th of your harvest. But people whispered that millers had heavy thumbs on the scales. That they cheated by holding back the fines or the bran. There were fistfights over it. Lawsuits. But you had no choice. Without the mill, you were back to the stone quern in your kitchen hand, turning a saddle-shaped stone hour after hour, until your shoulders burned and your corn was still half coarse. Walk down the lane from the mill, past the tavern with its swinging sign creaking in the breeze, and the air changes again. The keen dampness of water gives way to a sharp, metallic tang that stings the nose. Coal smoke, hot iron, charred hoof, the blacksmith. In winter, the smithy was the warmest place in town. More popular than church on a Sunday. More honest than the tavern. The forge glowed like a captured piece of the sun, first yellow, then orange, then blinding white hot when the bellows pumped full force. The bellows were massive leather lungs, patched and stiff with age, connected to a heavy chain that the apprentice pulled rhythmically. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The coals hissed and popped like bacon in a pan, sending sparks dancing up the stone chimney. The blacksmith stood at the heart of it all, stripped to the waist in summer, wearing a heavy leather apron in winter. His arms were thick as oak branches, scarred with old burns, black with soot except where sweat carved clean tracks down his chest. He was the town's magician, the fixer of all broken things. He didn't just shoe horses. That was the daily bread, watching the farrier lift a horse's leg, rasp the hoof smooth, fit the glowing shoe with a hiss of steam, and the smell of singed keratin. No, the blacksmith forged the nails that held your house together square, hand-wrought nails with square heads that bent rather than snapped under stress. He made the hinges for your heavy oak door, each one a flowing work of iron leaves or scrolls or acorns. He sharpened your plowshare until it could slice clay like butter. He mended the broken harrow tine, reheating it cherry red, hammering it straight on the anvil. If your axe head flew off mid-swing and was lost in the leaves, you brought the helve the wooden handle to him. He would drill a precise hole with a brace and bit, drift in a new iron head, and wedge it tight with oakum. The sound of the anvil was the clock of the town. Clang, clang, clang a light, rapid tapping for finishing a small hook or latch, thud, thud, clang a heavy, dull rhythm for shaping a plowshare or scythe blade. You could tell the weather by the apprentice's work slow and sloppy on rainy days, crisp and quick when the sun shone. But turn down the alley behind the smithy, past the pile of coal slag and broken barrel hoops, and the air turns foul. Urine, oak bark, rotting flesh. You found the tanner. Leather was the plastic of the 18th century. Shoes, breeches, saddles, aprons, buckets, belts, whips. Everything depended on it. But making it was hell on earth. The ton yard was a series of pits dug into the hillside, like steps to the underworld. Each pit held a different chemical bath, dark and stinking. First came the lime pit, a slurry of quicklime and stale urine to loosen the hair. Urine was collected from every household, every tavern latrine. Piss was money. The hides soaked there for days, the hair floating to the surface like scum. Then came the fleshing beam, a slanted table, where the tanner scraped the hides clean with a two-handled knife, the flesh side glistening pink, the smell of decay heavy in the air. Then the tanning vat spits of oak bark liquor, dark red and tannic, where the hides soaked for months, sometimes a year. The tanner walked wooden planks between the vats like a tightrope walker, his arms permanently stained brown up to the elbows. His clothes were stiff with oiled leather dust. His skin had a permanent chemical stink that no amount of washing could remove. Neighbors hated having the tannery upwind. From this filth came beauty: supple cowhide for boots, goat skin for gloves, deer skin for shirts soft as cloth after brain tanning, rubbed with animal brains and smoked over green hickory until it was waterproof and fragrant. Across the green from the tannery sat the cooperess shop quiet after the assault of the smithy and ton yard. Here the air smelled of toasted oak and fresh shavings. The cooper made barrels, the cardboard boxes of the era. Everything shipped in barrels: flour, nails, salted cod, gunpowder, rum, molasses. He worked with green oak staves, narrow planks tapered at the ends. He steamed them over a small fire until they bent like reeds, then ratcheted them tight with iron hoops hammered onto the ends. A tight cooper made liquid barrels from hogsheads for the Caribbean trade, watertight to the last drop. A slack cooper made dry goods barrels for flour or apples. The shop floor was ankle-deep in curly wood shavings, sweet-smelling and springy underfoot. The only sounds were the thunk of the mallet driving hoops, and the scritch-scratch of the draw-knife shaving staves smooth by eye. Inside the homes, the cottage industries never stopped. By firelight, a family might make wooden pegs for shoes, tiny oak nails whittled by the thousand, traded at the store for a twist of tobacco, or splint brooms from broomcorn, bound tight to hickory handles with linen cord, or rush seats for chairs, peeling green bulrush, soaking it overnight, weaving it tight through the frame until your fingers bled. Every object in colonial America had a fingerprint on it. Nothing was stamped out by machine. The mug you drank cider from was thrown on a kick wheel by a potter whose name you knew. The chair you sat on was joined by a carpenter down the lane, his mortise and tenon joints tight as a bank vault. The knife in your belt was forged by the blacksmith whose daughter you courted at meeting. The world was handmade, uneven, personal. This intimacy with objects created a different soul. You respected your tools because you knew the sweat in every hammer blow. You mended your coat a dozen times rather than discard it. You planed the edge of a table smooth with a wooden jack plane because crooked was tolerable, but sharp hurt the shin. The trades were the pulse beneath the skin of the town. From the white dust of the mill to the red glow of the forge to the brown pits of the tannery, they turned raw earth into civilization. And every night, as the hammers fell silent and the water wheels slowed, the craftsmen banked their fires, hung their aprons, and walked home through the dark to the smell of hasty pudding waiting. Let us leave the comforting rhythm of the town now. The hammers have fallen silent. The mill wheel drips to a stop. We are stepping onto the King's Highway, or what passed for one. Most colonists never traveled more than 20 miles from the farm where they were born. Abroad didn't mean Europe. It meant the next county over. A trip to Philadelphia or Boston was the adventure of a lifetime, spoken of 4 years afterward like a pilgrimage. The roads were a nightmare. They weren't paved. They weren't even graded. They were just widened Indian trails or cowpaths, scarred by tree stumps, potholes, and rocks the size of your fist. In summer, They were choking clouds of bone-dry dust that coated your throat and turned your spit to paste. In spring mud season, they were sucking quagmires that pulled the shoes off your horse and swallowed wagon wheels to the hub. Colonists called them corduroy roads when they got ambitious logs laid side by side. Like the ribs of a giant beast, they rattled your teeth loose and snapped axles like twigs. If you were wealthy, a merchant or a planter, you traveled by carriage or stagecoach. But this was no luxury sedan. The coaches were wooden boxes suspended on thick leather straps instead of springs. They swayed and lurched like a drunk on a ship, inducing coach sickness worse than any sea voyage. The windows were leather flaps that flapped open in the wind, letting in rain, dust, and branches. Inside, for passengers squeezed shoulder to shoulder on narrow benches, their knees knocking, their hats crushed. The journey from New York to Philadelphia, 90 miles, took 2 full days if the weather held. 3 or 4 if it rained. When the coach bogged down in mud, and it always did, everyone got out. Gentlemen in powdered wigs, ladies in silk hoops, all grabbing fence rails or saplings, pushing with skirts hiked up and stockings ruined. You arrived coated head to toe in clay the color of dried blood, reeking of wet wool and horse sweat. If you were poor, a farmer hauling tobacco to market, a peddler with his pack horse you walked. Shank's mare, they called it. Your only transport was shoe leather and a stout walking stick whittled from ash. You carried your worldly goods in a canvas sack or a wooden crate balanced on your head. You slept in barns when the farmer took pity, or under a hedge with your coat for a blanket. You begged meals at back doors, a crust of bread and a drink of small beer for a weary traveler. Good wife? But the horse was king. A good saddle horse was worth more than a milk cow. These weren't the sleek thoroughbreds of today. They were tough, deep-chested creatures bred for endurance, chestnuts, bays, roans with Roman noses and feathered fetlocks. You spent 10, 12 hours a day in the saddle, staring at the horse's twitching ears, feeling every jolt through your thighs and spine. The clop-squelch clop of iron-shod hooves became your heartbeat. You talked to your horse. You named it. It was family. Crossing water was the devil's own work. Bridges were rare, expensive to build, quick to wash out in floods. Most rivers were forded at shoals, shallow gravel bars where the current slowed. You rode your horse straight in, lifting your boots high to keep the powder dry, gripping the reins as the water swirled knee-deep around the barrel of the horse's chest. One misstep on a loose boulder, one panic from the horse, and you were swept downstream, thrashing in your heavy wool coat like a sodden sheep. Worse were the ferries. Flat rafts poled or roped across wide rivers like the Delaware or the Hudson. You led your horse onto the rocking platform, the timbers creaking under the weight. The ferryman, a grizzled man with forearms like oak roots pushed off with a long pole, the current grabbing the raft like a hand. Horses panicked in the middle, hooves slipping on wet planks, eyes rolling white. More men drowned on ferries than in shipwrecks. Bodies washed up days later, bloated and blue, their pockets turned out by the current. Along these god-forsaken roads, salvation swung from a post. The tavern sign, a crudely painted white swan, a red lion, a king's head grinning through tobacco stains. Seeing that swinging sign after 10 miles of jolting purgatory was religious ecstasy. You turned into the dooryard, stiff legs folding like bellows, back screaming, bladder full. Step inside the ordinary, that's what they called taverns, and the world shifted. The air was a wall of heat and haze roasting mutton, spilled flip, Wedwell drying by the fire, to dozen clay pipes belching blue tobacco smoke thick as fog. The low-beamed ceiling dripped with condensation. The sanded floor stuck to your boots. Men crowded the trestle tables, drovers in leather aprons, merchants in rusty black, farmers with dirt under their nails shouting over pewter tankards, slapping down cards, arguing politics. You didn't get a private room. You paid for a place. This meant a straw pallet on the floor of the chambers upstairs, or if you were flush, a spot in the common bed. 4, 5, 6 strangers to a feather bed, spooned like herrings, coats on against lice and farts. You woke with a drover's elbow in your ribs, a peddler's snores in your ear, bedbugs marching down your neck. The food was hearty, if dubious. Boiled fowl with dumplings floating like drowned mice. Salt pork fried crisp in its own grease. Beans and brown bread. Whiskey, landlord. You'd rasp, throat raw from dust. But the real magic was the flip. Beer, rum, sugar, and a red-hot iron loggerhead plunged hissing from the fire. The mud frothed and caramelized, tasting of burnt malt and pirate treasure. 1 flip warmed you, to made the road bearable. 3, and you staggered to bed singing Lillibalero. Yet the road was also the information highway. Enter the post-rider hero of the colonies. These men rode relay on the finest horses, mailbags slung saddle-high, pistols at their belts. Rain, snow, mud they rode. When a rider blew his tin horn entering town to toot-toot, everything stopped. Farmers left their plows. Women wiped floury hands. He brought newspapers 3 weeks stale from London, letters with red wax seals business or black edging death. He was the internet, the FedEx truck, the evening news. People mobbed him at the tavern as he gulped cider. What is the word from Virginia? War with the French? Tobacco at 4p the pound? He carried private griefs to love letters, bills of divorce, wills, runaway ads, strayed. A sorrel mare with a white stocking. And don't forget the coastal road. For many, the ocean was easier than land. Sloops and schooners hugged the shore from Boston to Charleston, cheaper and faster than stage. Life aboard was wet purgatory. You slept on damp cargo barrels of salted beef rolling underfoot. You navigated by headland shapes, watercolor, bird flocks. Gales smashed you against rocky coasts. The widow's walk on seaside houses got its name from wives pacing those railed roofs, scanning empty horizons for sails that never returned. Travel shaped the colonial soul. It bred toughness. A man who forded the Susquehanna in March flood was unbreakable, but it also bred longing for home, for clean straw, for a face that wasn't sunburned and travel-stained. After days on the road, arriving anywhere felt holy. The familiar church spire, the creak of your own gate, the smell of hasty pudding bubbling. You banked the fire, piled on quilts, and slept the sleep of the delivered. Yet even in sleep, the road whispered. Dreams of rivers that never ended, horizons that receded forever, the knowledge that tomorrow the ruts waited. The fire is dying now. The great oak log we threw on hours ago has crumbled into a bed of glowing red coals, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. The shadows in the corners of the room are stretching, reaching out to touch the furniture. This is the time of night the colonists called the dead of night. We must understand that their world was much more crowded than ours. Not with people the nearest neighbor might be 3 miles away through deep woods, but with the unseen. They lived in a world where the supernatural was perfectly natural. God was real. The devil was real. Angels, demons, and witches were not metaphors. They were neighbors. When a colonist looked into a dark corner, he didn't just see a lack of light. He saw a hiding place. Imagine the absolute darkness of a colonial night. We cannot truly conceive of it. We have streetlights, LEDs, the glow of cities on the horizon. But in 1750, when the moon was new, the darkness was a physical weight. It pressed against the windows. It felt like velvet. If you stepped outside to use the privy, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You navigated by memory and by the feel of the path under your feet. In this darkness, the stars were terrifyingly bright. The Milky Way was a slashed scar of diamond dust across the sky. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, shimmered in curtains of blood red and green. To a modern eye, it's beautiful. To a colonial eye, it was an omen. God is angry, they would whisper, watching the sky burn. War is coming. Inside the house, the family prepared for the most dangerous part of the day, sleep. Sleep was a surrender. You were helpless, so you protected yourself. You might see a horseshoe nailed above the door iron to repel spirits, or a hex sign painted on the barn. If you dug under the hearthstone of an old colonial house, you might find a witch bottle. This was a small ceramic jug filled with urine, bent pins, and iron nails, corked tight and buried upside down. It was a spiritual landmine designed to trap a witchess, curse and turn it back on her. They lived their lives behind invisible fortifications. Why? Because things went wrong constantly, and they needed a reason. Why did the butter not turn from cream today? A witch is in the churn. Why did the cow dry up? Asterisk the evil eye. Asterisk why did the baby fall ill? A spirit passed through the room. They didn't have bacteria. They didn't have viruses. They had malice, and malice had a face. But eventually, the fear gave way to fatigue. The routine of bed was strict. The bed warmer, a brass pan on a long wooden handle, was filled with hot coals from the fire. The mother would slide it between the icy linen sheets, moving it quickly so as not to scorch the fabric, taking the deathly chill off the mattress. The beds were high off the ground to avoid drafts and fleas. They were surrounded by heavy wool curtains. When you climbed in and drew the curtains tight, you were in a room within a room, a warm, dark cocoon. They wore nightcaps, linen caps for men and women, because they believed the soul could escape through the head if it got too cold, or that demons could enter through the ears. So they tied their caps tight under their chins, and then they slept. But not like we do. They practiced segmented sleep. They went to bed early, around 8 or 9 p.m. They slept deeply for 4 hours, the first sleep. Then, around 1 o'clock or 2 a.m., they woke up. Naturally, the whole house would stir. This watch in the middle of the night was a magical time. The world was silent. The fire was low. Husband and wife would talk quietly in the dark. They might pray. They might smoke a pipe in bed, a dangerous habit. Neighbors claimed they did their best thinking during this hour. It was a time of perfect peace between two blocks of rest. After an hour or so, they would drift back off into the second sleep, not waking until the rooster crowed at dawn. Let us listen to the house now. The timber frame is cooling. The wood contracts with a sharp crack that sounds like a pistol shot in the silence. The wind whistles down the chimney, carrying the scent of snow. A mouse skitters inside the wall. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The breathing of the family is a rhythmic chorus. There is a profound sense of isolation here. No police to call, no ambulance, no internet. Just this wooden box, this fire, and the people you love, floating in a sea of ancient wilderness. It was a hard life, a life of calluses, wood smoke, salt pork, and fear. A life where death was always at the dinner table, but it was also a life of immense connection. You knew where your food came from. You knew the name of the man who made your shoes. You knew the stories of every person in your village. You were part of a fabric so tight it could survive the winter. They were our ancestors. They walked these muddy paths so we could drive on paved roads. They shivered in drafty cabins so we could adjust our thermostats. They stared down the walls so we could sleep with unlocked doors. We carry their history in our bones. We carry their superstitions in our habits when we knock on wood. When we say God bless you after a sneeze, we are still them, just with better lighting. The fire is almost out now. Just a faint orange glow in the grey ash. The room is cold. The heavy quilt feels good on your shoulders. The darkness is total. Let the forest stand watch outside. Let the river freeze over the stones. Let the owl hunt in the pine trees. We are safe inside. The door is barred. The witch bottle is buried. The prayers are said. We have walked the long day. We have turned the wheel. We have survived the night. Sleep well, traveler. The history is done. The rest is yours. Thank you for listening to this ultra-long journey into the past. I hope the mud, the smoke, and the silence have carried you far away from the noise of today. If you are still awake, please leave a comment. Tell me which part of the past you want to visit next. The Middle Ages, the Vikings, the quiet libraries of ancient Rome. But for now, good night.